been looking at a historic question that has confronted not only American religion, but certainly Christianity in any time and in any culture. And that question is the tension between resistance to the culture that you live in, or the accommodation, the way in which one appropriates certain elements from society. And we've looked at Puritans, who are pretty good examples, I think, of people who tried to resist the culture that they lived in, to call their society to a higher, more distinctive way of being disciples for Christ. And we've looked the last couple weeks at models of accommodation, where the first Great Awakening and then the second Great Awakening tried to selectively appropriate elements from the culture in order to speak to the culture, to be leaven within the culture or light unto the society. And the last time I suggested that the second Great Awakening represented a kind of triumph of popular religious sovereignty in America, that Americans wanted church done in a way that really resonated with who they were at that moment in that place. And as a result, the Second Great Awakening was pretty effective at reworking some traditional elements of religion. Out went, well, replacing, we'll put it that way, some of the more traditional denominations were new, homegrown religious movements that were distinctively American in their tone and voice. There were new approaches to hermeneutics rather than the traditional, the clergy says, the text says this. Now you have common sense coming from really the people interpreting the text. And you have a transition in ecclesiology so that you don't have a hierarchical structure, but it is truly popular religious sovereignty where the authority comes from the congregation. And you have changes and transformations in church music and sermon styles. Thus, what I was suggesting was in 19th century Protestantism, it started looking increasingly like a projection of American culture. One historian has even suggested that evangelical revivalism became a kind of folk expression, in the same way that you might have elements from material culture where a quilt looks particularly American, or a style of furniture, the shaker, looks distinctively American, that on the religious front, this revivalism had a very American feel to it. Well, to be fair, we all have to admit that it's impossible for anyone to be acultural, to be able to step completely outside of his or her moment in time, society, and live as if none of that culture has ever shaped their life or their thought. That's just unrealistic, and it might even be irresponsible. But the question remains the extent to which we will be aware of the ways in which that culture does work its way into our religious expression, and how far we're willing to let that influence go in order to be contemporary and relevant. And should we privilege one side over another, the resistance to culture, the fight against cultural influences, or should we privilege the accommodation, selective accommodation and acculturation? So that dilemma keeps going. And in the 19th century, simultaneous with the Second Great Awakening, there were people who were trying to fight, resist this cultural influence and the accommodationist strategy of the Second Great Awakening. These people were more interested in reform of American culture and religious expression than revival and the appropriation of American culture. Now, because of all the emphasis on revivalism, it's easy to miss the people who had a reformist approach. But Ralph Waldo Emerson confessed to Thomas Carlyle, quote, "We're all a little wild here with numberless projects of social reform. Every reading man has a draft of a new community in his waistcoat pocket." In other words, there's just lots of people in America who are thinking not about how can I just sort of have my needs met, but how can I change the culture in which I live? How can I reform it? So like the Puritans, these reform minded crusading critics offered a kind of Jeremiad, if you will, a series of laments or challenges for what they perceived to be the declension of American life and religion. Now, some of these Jeremiahs, these prophets, these reformists, had pretty legitimate concerns. And a few others were a bit more, shall we say, creative in their constructive criticism. So I want to mention some of both. And I want you to think about how far you would go with some of these reforms. Are these all right? Are these good? Is this what America needs? So the first reformist impulse I want to call your attention to is a missions effort. Now, missions is pretty straightforward stuff. Christians are for missions. But what's new at this time, and to help promote the reformist agenda, is the emphasis on missionary societies. And the first and greatest of the missionary societies in American religion was the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, rather long term, and frequently you'll just see it referred to as the ABCFM. Now, this American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions started at Williams College in Massachusetts in 1806. And you wouldn't think of it, but it really came together because of a thunderstorm. Because the students and some of the faculty at this college would frequently go out into the countryside. Apparently it was a fairly rural section. And they would hold devotionals. Well, apparently this group that was having this particular devotional got really caught up in the moment because they didn't realize that a thunderstorm, a pretty severe thunderstorm, was bearing down on them until it was literally on top of them. Now, you got to be pretty deep in prayer to miss the thunder and lightning, but they weren't getting it, and they realized that they were in trouble. They couldn't make it to cover, so they decided, looking around, that there was a haystack in the field over there, and they would go over there and they would burrow their way into the haystack, and that would protect them from the elements. So they all make a dash over to the haystack. They burrow their way into the haystack, and while they're riding out the storm, they decide, well, we'll continue the devotional. What else are you going to do, I guess? So they do. And while they're in there, they're particularly concerned about the failures of American culture and American Christians to carry the gospel message forward. So they start talking about new ways of organizing themselves to carry the message out. And that's how the ABC-FM came to be created during this haystack prayer meeting in 1806 at Williams College. And they did a remarkable job. In their first 50 years, the ABC-FM managed to send out and fund 1,000 missionaries. Not bad. Not bad at all. And their primary emphasis had been on the Pacific and the Orient. But the ABC-FM also had an initiative to convert the Cherokee Indian. And so toward that end, they created the Brainerd Mission near what is today Chattanooga, Tennessee, named after one of the most famous 18th century missionaries to the Indians, David Brainerd, the would-be son-in-law of Jonathan Edwards, who managed to edit David Brainerd's diary after Brainerd's death. Well, the ABC-FM's Brainerd Mission had considerable success. They had numerous converts. They managed to convert a good number of the Cherokee. They managed to print the Bible, to translate it into the Cherokee language, and then print it so that it was accessible. They had several of their converts sent to seminary at Andover Theological Seminary in Massachusetts, which was in many ways the hub of reformist activity and thought. And things were going remarkably well until a Tennessean became president. Andrew Jackson comes along, and one of the first things he says is, the Cherokee have got to go. I want them out of here. I want them removed across over the Mississippi River. Well, that wasn't going to do much for this mission effort there at Brainerd. And the ABC-FM missionaries started leading the charge to resist President Jackson's Indian removal policy. In particular, Samuel Worcester one of the missionaries sent by the ABC-FM challenged not only the president, but the state of Georgia, all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and won. And Jackson's response? Let him see if he can enforce it. He sent the U.S. Army and said, exile them, get them out. Samuel Worcester and some of the ABC-FM missionaries resisted even to the form of civil disobedience and went to jail fighting for the Cherokee Indian against the U.S. president. And when they were finally marched out, these missionaries went with them on the Trail of Tears in their own form of Babylonian captivity across the way. And the ABC-FM became a model in many ways for thousands of parachurch missionary organizations, resisting culture, resisting their own culture, because it needed reform. This was the right thing to do. And in addition to missions, another approach where people were criticizing American culture was in the form of abolition, the abolitionist movement. Now, in the South, chattel slavery was an economic system that supported the economy, and a lot of ministers supported and justified the practice of slavery from texts from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And although most people in the North were not abolitionists, there were some who saw the cause as their prophetic call to American society. One of those individuals is a guy named Theodore Weld. Theodore Weld, in 1825, was converted at one of Charles Grandison Finney's revivals. And Theodore Weld was going to be himself one of these great American revivalists. But over the course of the next few years, he got caught up in the abolitionist crusade as his religious vocation. And in 1832, he enrolled at the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. And over the course of the next couple years, he and some of his fellow seminarians became nicknamed the Lane Rebels, because whenever they had the chance, they were arguing from the Bible why slavery had to go. They created all kinds of problems, the dissent, the frustration. Finally, the administration called them in and said, you guys have either got to stop it, or we're going to expel you from school. And they said, you're going to expel us for preaching the gospel? And they said, well, we have a question about what you're preaching and whether it is the gospel. Well, they kept going, and in fact were expelled from the Lane Theological Seminary and moved up in Ohio to Oberlin College and created an abolitionist base there at Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. And there provided many of the resources and the strategies for running the Underground Railroad. And several people, as the Civil War eventually erupts, called Oberlin, Ohio, the town that started the Civil War. And for them, the Civil War was almost a holy cause, a righteous cause, because America needed this reform. Theodore Weld's writing especially influenced Harriet Beecher Stowe, who, because of his inspiration, will write Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I suspect that Theodore Weld's writing also influenced Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. That's a righteous, crusading hymn. It's a faith-based, reform-minded call. And it's not just Theodore Weld or Harriet Beecher Stowe or Julia Ward Howe, but of course Frederick Douglass, a name that we often hear about as an abolitionist, but we typically don't think of him as a faith-based abolitionist. But he was. He was born, of course, into slavery and escaped slavery. But before he escaped, he learned how to read. And he said, when I learned how to read, especially the Bible, I knew from that moment forward I would be forever free. You could hold my physical body in chains, but my mind was liberated because I could read the Bible. And so, having escaped in 1838, he then went forward with this call for abolition and became one of the most eloquent, articulate, faith-based abolitionists in America. Listen to this reform, this prophetic call. This is from his narrative. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good and pure and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. That's a pretty powerful prophetic call. But that's where others were. They weren't accommodating, appropriating from culture. They were fighting it. They saw problems, and those problems had to be isolated and dealt with and removed. Well, a little closer to home, in addition to missions and abolition, you also have, as a reform issue, the temperance crusade. This is the same time. Now, for a long time in American history, alcohol was just part of the culture. It was a popular drink. It was also about as much medicine as people had at their disposal, especially out on the frontier. There were few religious taboos except for the abuse of alcohol, in particular drunkenness. But that was a problem, because in an 1810 survey, somebody looking into alcoholic consumption in America found out that the average American was drinking 10 gallons of hard liquor a year. We're not talking about cider and wine. We're talking about the bourbon and all that hard stuff. 10 gallons a year for the average American? And as American life became more industrialized and time-driven, people couldn't live that way. And so increasingly they were saying, it's the right thing, it's the best thing, it's the godly thing to call people to a better existence. And so in 1826 you'll have the formation of the American Temperance Society. First, to promote the voluntary reduction in alcohol consumption, but very quickly they went from reduction to abstinence from consumption. And eventually you'll get states passing prohibition laws. But there was a little problem with that. How do Christians take stand against alcohol when every Sunday on the Lord's table there's wine? You know, can we really promote complete abstinence when that's a central part of who we are? And some people, especially Methodists and Baptists, wondered what they ought to do about that. Well, luckily, a New Jersey dentist helped them out, because this guy sat down and figured out a way to pasteurize grape juice so that it would not ferment over the course of time. His last name was Welch, so that you could have unfermented grape juice and not worry that, in fact, it would become sinful alcohol. Well, a generation later, there was another, perhaps more colorful temperance crusader. Her name was Carrie Nation. Now, Carrie Nation was about 6 feet tall, and as the record says, exceptionally strong. She was in every way an imposing sight, and she was a devout prohibitionist. Her approach was to use an interventionist strategy, to commit, she says, a hatchetation. A hatchetation? What in the world? What she would do, she and her gang would go into a community and they would find out what the popular bar was. And they would watch to see when the crowd really peaked. And then they would bust in and they would be dressed out in paramilitary outfits. And in one hand she would have the Bible, and in another hand she would have a hatchet. And she would announce that they were there to commit a hatchetation. And they would go around and they would take their weapons and bust up the joint. They would break the bottles. They would open the kegs. They would just completely demolish the place as she continued preaching and singing as she went about her work and berating the customers And then when she had their attention, she would get up in their face with her hatchet, and she'd say, now it's time for you to commit to prohibition. You're ready to submit, aren't you? And of course, with somebody with a hatchet up next to your face, you were saying, yes, I will take the pledge right now. And it was kind of effective, except for when she got thrown in prison. But she saw this as her call, her mission, her religious vocation. There were people who also saw immigration restriction as a form of religious reform, because America had been a very Protestant country, and now increasingly in the 19th century, with immigration, you have the rise of Roman Catholicism. Lyman Beecher, one of the biggest named preachers in America at the time, in 1835 left New England and moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, because he was convinced that the Pope was going to move the Vatican over to Cincinnati. He said, just think about it. The Vatican's old, it's run down, it's falling in. Cincinnati's new, clean, pristine, beautiful. Anybody in their right mind would move the Vatican to Cincinnati. So he moved out there to beat the Pope and to set up sort of a Protestant wall to keep the Catholics out. Well, there were some people who picked up on this. And one of the most enterprising was a young lady named Maria Monk, who the year after, in 1836, published a book entitled 6 Months in a Convent, where she described being held captive against her will within the walls of a convent. And there she learned, in fact, that many of the suspicions were true, that in fact the Pope was going to come and take over America, and that convents really were dens of iniquity, where all kinds of moral indiscretions go on. It sold remarkably well. It was the best seller in the 19th century up until Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold so well, she decided to follow it up with another book. This one's entitled Awful Disclosures. Don't you just love that title? That one's got to work. And in this one was really to get her on the talk shows of the day. The book announced that Jesuits, this group within the Catholic tradition, they can actually read your mind, and they know what Protestants are thinking. And that priests go out and they kidnap young kids and they bring them in and they hold them against their wills. And you know the reason why nuns always wear those big flowing habits is because they're actually pregnant all the time. And all these kinds of things, these lurid, sensationalized descriptions that people really wanted to read. It plugged right into the fears that they had at the moment. It got so bad that some cities actually passed ordinances saying, upon demand, we want to go in, surprise inspections on convents and monasteries to make sure that what's being reported going on isn't actually going on. And it led to, in cities like Charlestown, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Louisville, Kentucky, they would actually roll out cannon and blast the front doors open on some of these convents so they could get in there. You had firefights in the middle of the streets over this kind of stuff, so people took it very seriously. Now, truth be known, Maria Monk's mother actually told the truth on her. Her real name was Rebecca Reed, and early in life she had suffered a pretty severe head trauma, and for the rest of her life could have problem distinguishing fact from fiction, and had actually worked as a prostitute for a short time. But she plugged into what was legitimized by a person like Lyman Beecher. So you've got missions. Well, that makes sense. Abolition, sure. Temperance, yeah. Immigration restriction. But for many people, this was a righteous cause. And another righteous cause that was catching on was the health reform movement. Because if you're going to be a good Christian, and you're going to be a successful disciple for Christ, crusading for these necessary reforms, well, you got to have a good body for doing it, sustaining the fight the same way that the army brings in and drills its troops and makes sure that they can pass the physical tests. Maybe Christians ought to have those types of physical requirements as well. And so they started pushing these. Good physical conditioning was a good spiritual discipline. Let me tell you a couple stories about individuals who pushed this. One is Sylvester Graham. I don't know if he's any distant relative to Billy Graham or not, But in the 1830s, he prophetically called Christians to reform their bodies so that they could better reform culture. The kingdom of God, he said, quote, can never be expected to arrive until those laws which God has implanted in the physical nature of humanity, equal with God's moral laws, are universally known and obeyed. We can't get to the kingdom of God unless we get our bodies straightened up. And so he urged some restriction on things like meat, coffee and tea, medicinal drugs, corsets, and junk food. Now forget all the other stuff about being critical of American culture. Can you imagine American culture without those? Coffee, tea, junk food, meat. I mean, they're going after some of the real elements, essential elements of the American identity. He said, no. Christians must eat a good, healthy diet, such things as fruits, vegetables, and especially whole grains. These reduce the fleshly passions. They keep you focused on the work at hand. And to help, especially with the consumption of whole grains, he developed a process for milling the wheat. He called it grammized, and then took the wheat and put it together in a cracker, so that the graham cracker started as sort of, if you will, the essential Christian food. I suspect we've added a little bit to the recipe to make it a bit more palatable at this point, but that was part of his mission, his calling. A similar individual is an individual who was a physician in Michigan. He developed a practice of what he called biologic living, and founded a sanatorium, a place where you could go and live by a regimen of good, clean water, lots of exercise, abstinence, and sunshine. You know, a sort of health club for the spiritual disciplines. And there, the menu avoided such things as meat or dairy products, alcohol, or caffeine, because all these tended to increase the passions and lusts of the flesh. And he focused on not so much wheat, but corn. That the essential Christian food would be corn, and you need more of it. And to help you be able to consume enough of it, he developed a process for putting the corn into flakes. The founding of corn flakes at his Battle Creek, Michigan health club. His name, of course, is John Harvey Kellogg, Kellogg. So now you can truly taste cornflakes again for the very first time, right? Because this was supposed to be sort of the essential food that would help Christians achieve their reform agendas. Now, like I say, some of these prophetic attempts to reform American life and culture were good and necessary, and they challenged Christians not to just mindlessly follow the lead of culture. On the other hand, they could become, on occasion, a bit trivial, sometimes counterproductive, and on occasion even bigoted. But they forced Americans and Christians in America to decide what issues and what matters are of importance. What can you hold on to? What must you embrace? And what can you sacrifice? What is the real mission of the church and Christians in that society? And how do you go about? What are the right methods and strategies for affecting God's work within a society?